Causes of the Revolt of 1857. There were many factors that accounted for the Revolt of 1857. Most significant among these are described here. Discontent of former ruling families. The British policies of annexation and conquest demoralized many Indian rulers and chiefs. Policies such as subsidiary alliance and the doctrine of lapse particularly infused a sense of deprivation and discontent in their minds. The annexation of Awadh in 1856 on the grounds of maladministration further intensified it. The company's sepoys also felt hurt since most of them belonged to Awadh. Around this time, the Governor-General Dalhousie announced that after the death of the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II, his descendants would no longer enjoy the royal privileges accorded to them as the traditional rulers of the subcontinent. Similarly, following the death of Peshwa Bajirao II, his adopted son, Nana Sahib, was refused the pension the Peshwa had been getting as the head of the Marathas. These developments offended the science of other royal families who feared that a similar fate awaited them after the loss of powers and privileges. In the territories annexed by the British, the administrative machinery that had existed so far was abolished. As a result, all those people who had been part of the old administrative system lost their jobs. Discontent of peasants and artisans. The policy of economic exploitation followed by the British affected all sections of Indian society. Due to high revenue demands and ruthless system of revenue collection, life of the peasants became miserable. They lost most of their traditional rights and were deprived of their land. Due to the massive inflow of cheap goods manufactured in British factories, Indian handmade goods lost their market. Besides being less costly, machine-made goods were also available in large quantities. This led to the impoverishment of Indian artisans and craftspersons. Discontented sepoys. The sepoys or Indian soldiers formed about 7/8 of the total British troops in India, but they were often subjected to discriminatory provisions and rules by their British superiors. Besides, they were paid much less than British soldiers. Avenues of promotion were minimal for them, as all the higher posts in the army were reserved for the people of British descent. The sepoys were also forbidden to wear caste and sectarian marks such as tilak or beard or turban. Rules regarding their overseas services further hurt their religious sentiments. A number of sepoys were part-time peasants or came from peasant artisan families living in the villages, so they naturally sympathized with the sufferings of the peasants and traditional craftspersons. Colonial initiatives for social reform. During the British rule, a number of legislations were passed to stop various negative social practices. These legislations or laws included those relating to the abolition of sati, legalization of widow remarriage, and the extension of Western education to women. Conservative sections of Indian society looked upon these legislations with great suspicion. They thought that the British were trying to interfere in the social customs of the country. Policy of racial and cultural discrimination. A large section of the British colonial authorities believed that they were racially and culturally superior to the Indians. Their discriminatory administrative policies and practices reflected their racial arrogance. So, educated Indians had very little chances of appointment to high positions and promotion compared to their British counterparts. The activities of Christian missionaries, their zeal for religious conversion, and public attacks on Hinduism and Islam they indulged in also angered the common people. Moreover, the land belonging to the temples and mosques was either confiscated or taxed heavily. As a result, many families dependent on them were deprived of their income. Thus, the belief that their religion was under threat united different sections of society against the colonial. Why did the revolt fail? The Revolt of 1857 was a landmark event in the history of India. It shook the foundations of British rule in India. However, as we have seen, it failed to achieve its objectives. Some major factors that accounted for its failure are described ahead. Largely localized character. One of the most important reasons for the failure of the revolt was its localized character. The Bengal province, the Bombay Presidency, and the Madras Presidency almost completely stayed away from the revolt. The large princely states of Hyderabad, Mysore, Travancore, and Kashmir, and the states of Rajputana too did not join the revolt. In Punjab, the Sikh princes actively supported the company rather than the rebels. Lack of visionary leadership. Most of the leaders associated with the revolt lack any clear perception of India as a nation. They had no collective agenda and strategies. They mostly thought of their own interests and personal gains. None of them had the will and vision to coordinate the movement and give it purpose and direction. Lack of common ideals. There was no unity and common ideal among the revolutionaries. The Hindus wanted to set up a Maratha Raj, while the Muslims wanted to revive the Mughal rule. Instead of working out an alternative to the colonial system and going for its realization, they only wanted to go back to the past. Lack of support from the emerging middle class. The emerging middle class did not support the rebels. Members of this class believed that only the British could take India into the modern age. As such, they did not support the rural and feudal elements who played the most significant part in the uprising. Old and outdated technology. The rebels lacked access to advanced warfare technologies and weaponry. They fought with outdated weapons and therefore failed to compete with the sophisticated and modern weapons of the British. Secret negotiations with the British. Those Indian princes and chiefs who had been allowed to continue by the British sided with the British during the revolt. When the revolt gathered momentum, many rulers who took part in it started negotiations with the British for the restoration of their rights. Thus, they betrayed the cause cherished by the rebels. Results of the revolt. The suppression of the revolt of 1857 was followed by some important changes in the structure, composition, and character of British administrative system and practices. End of the company's rule. By an act passed by the British Parliament, also known as the Queen's Proclamation, in August 1858, the rule of the EEIC in India formally came to an end. All powers relating to governance in the Indian subcontinent were transferred from the EEIC to the British Crown. From then onwards, the British Parliament became fully responsible for managing Indian affairs. Thus, the British government accepted the direct responsibility for ruling India. Appointment of the Secretary of State for India. The Act of 1858 also abolished the Board of Directors and the Board of Control. A member of the British Cabinet was appointed and made responsible for the administration of India. He came to be known as the Secretary of State for India. He was to be advised by a council called the India Council. The Governor-General of India now became the Viceroy of India, which meant a personal representative of the Crown. Lord Canning became the first Viceroy under the Crown. Reorganization of the Indian Army. The Indian Army was reorganized to prevent future revolts. It was declared that the proportion of Indian soldiers in the army would be reduced and the number of European soldiers would be increased. Assurances to all Indian ruling chiefs. All ruling chiefs of the country were assured that their territory would never be annexed in future. They were allowed to pass on their kingdoms to their heirs, including adopted sons. However, they were made to acknowledge the British Queen as their sovereign paramount or their supreme ruler. More respect to the customs and religious practices of the people of India. To win over the loyalty of the orthodox sections of society, the British government promised not to interfere in India's religious and social customs. Inspired Indians for nationalist movement. The heroic fight against the colonial rule served as a constant source of inspiration. the perception of the people in India about themselves and their country changed forever. It blazed the trail for the rise of the nationalist movement, about which we will read later in subsequent chapters. Spread of the revolt. A number of small rulers and princes joined the proposed confederacy under the leadership of the Mughal emperor. From Meerut and Delhi, the revolt spread to other areas in northern and central India. Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, Bareilly, Gwalior and Ara became the major centers of the revolt. Meerut. As we have already read, the revolt started at Meerut, where sepoys refused to use greased cartridges. After the mutiny, they attacked jails, released prisoners and marched down to Delhi. Delhi. When the rebellious soldiers reached Delhi, they were joined by the local infantry. They killed their officers and captured the city. Under the leadership of the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar II, the mutiny of soldiers changed into a broad-based popular struggle against the colonial state represented by the EEIC. Kanpur. Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the last Peshwa Bajirao II, led the revolt in Kanpur. His armed forces expelled the British garrison from the city. He acknowledged the overlordship of Emperor Bahadur Shah II. He was assisted and supported by Tatya Tope and Azimullah. Lucknow. In Lucknow, Burgess Qadir, the son of the deposed Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, was proclaimed the new Nawab. He too acknowledged the suzerainty of Bahadur Shah Zafar. His mother Begum Hazrat Mahal took an active part in organizing the uprising against the British. She was supported by the peasants, sepoys and talukdars who were inspired by Maulvi Ahmadullah. The British army failed to fight the revolutionaries and took refuge in the Residency building on the banks of the Gomti River. The Residency was set on fire by the revolutionaries, in which the British resident Henry Lawrence died. Jhansi. Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi was one of the greatest leaders of the revolt. When the British came to annex her territory, she joined the rebels who had mutinied. The British forces, using superior weapons, captured the fort and the city. The Rani fled with the rebels to join Tatya Tope at Kalpi. They decided to march upon Gwalior. Maharaja Scindia of Gwalior joined the British camp, while his troops joined the forces of the Rani. Tatya Tope's small but disciplined army, helped by villagers, carried on guerrilla warfare. Bareilly. The sepoys in Bareilly rose in revolt on 31st May, forcing the British officers to flee. The uprising was led by Khan Bahadur Khan, a pensioner of the British government. Arra. In Arra, Bihar, an old zamindar named Kunwar Singh played a leading part in the revolt of 1857. The rebellious sepoys destroyed European property, particularly indigo factories. Kunwar Singh died of war wounds in April 1858. The revolt spread to other parts of the Bihar province, such as Ranchi and Sambalpur. Suppression of the revolt and the fate of the rebels. Though the British faced some initial setbacks, their response was swift and ruthless. By 1858, most of the rebels had been defeated. Sir John Nicholson besieged Delhi and succeeded in recapturing it in September 1857. Bahadur Shah Zafar was taken prisoner. His two sons were shot dead before his eyes by a British officer called Lieutenant Hudson. Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled to Rangoon in Burma, Myanmar, where he died in 1862. However, even after this, people continued to resist and battle the British. In March 1858, British forces led by Sir Colin Campbell ultimately recaptured Lucknow with the help of Gurkha soldiers. Begum Hazrat Mahal escaped to Nepal. Rani Lakshmi Bai was driven out of Jhansi. With the help of Tatya Tope, she captured Gwalior but was killed in June 1858. Tatya Tope was captured in 1859 and hanged. In Kanpur, a British troop led by General Havelock defeated Nana Sahib, who fled to Nepal and was never heard of again. Thus, the revolt was suppressed by 1858 to 59, though it took the British many more years to restore peace in the areas affected by the revolt. Hundreds of sepoys, rebels, nawabs, zamindars, local chiefs and even common civilians were tried and hanged. Their land and assets were confiscated. So, uprisings of localized character continued to take place, posing threat to the British authorities.